When we think of World War I, most people picture the muddy trenches of France, the thunder of artillery, and weary soldiers trapped in endless battles. But few realize that far across the oceans, another nation was quietly rewriting its destiny, a nation not of Europe but of the East, Japan. Here's the shocking truth. While the world remembers Britain, France, and Germany, Japan's involvement in the Great War is often treated as a footnote. Yet, behind that silence lies a story of ambition, pride, and power, a story that shaped the course of the entire 20th century. In 1914, as Europe plunged into chaos, Japan stood at a crossroads. The nation had spent decades racing toward modernization after centuries of isolation. The samurai were gone, railways now crisscrossed the islands, and Western suits had replaced robes in the halls of power. But beneath the surface, Japan's leaders burned with a single question: would the West ever truly accept them as equals? When Britain, Japan's ally under the 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance, called for help against Germany, the answer seemed within reach. Japan's government saw not just an opportunity to honor its alliance, but to prove itself to the world. If they fought alongside the great European powers, perhaps Japan would finally be seen as one of them, modern, civilized, and strong. But there was another motive, one that the West preferred not to see. Japan's leaders weren't just joining a war, they were seizing an empire. Germany's colonies in China and the Pacific lay vulnerable, unguarded jewels scattered across the sea. For Japan, this was a chance to expand influence without firing a single shot in Europe's trenches. Imagine the scene inside the Imperial Palace in Tokyo in August 1914. Ministers gather under the golden crest of the chrysanthemum throne. Maps of Asia stretch across the tables. The Prime Minister, Hokuma Shigenobu, leans forward. "If we act swiftly," he says, "we can strike Germany in the east before the others even notice." The room falls silent. They all know what's at stake. A chance to dominate Asia while Europe bleeds itself dry. That night, the decision is made. Japan will enter the war. Officially, it's to protect peace in the East. Unofficially, it's to reshape the map of the Pacific. On August 23, 1914, Japan declares war on Germany. Across Europe, newspapers barely mention it. To them, it's a side note. The Orient joins the Allies. But to the people of Japan, it's a moment of pride. The emperor's words echo across the nation. Flags rise, temples fill with prayers, and ships begin to move. In the harbors of Sasebo and Yokosuka, the Imperial Japanese Navy, sleek, modern, disciplined, readies for action. Their target, Qingdao, a German-controlled port in China's Shandong province. To most of the world, it's an obscure colonial outpost. To Japan, it's a symbol of Western arrogance, planted in their backyard. And so begins Japan's first major campaign of the war, the Siege of Qingdao. The Japanese forces, side by side with a small British contingent, surround the city. For nearly 2 months, cannons thunder and shells fall. When Qingdao finally surrenders in November 1914, the Japanese flag rises over its forts. It's a short campaign, but its meaning is immense. For the first time, an Asian power has captured European territory on Asian soil. To the Japanese, it's not just a victory, it's vindication. Proof that they belong among the world's great empires. But behind the triumph lies an uneasy truth. While Japan celebrates, the Western powers look on with quiet discomfort. They had invited Japan to help, yes, but not to grow stronger. Britain and France begin to realize that Japan's ambitions extend far beyond loyalty or duty. Still, Japan continues to play the part of the loyal ally. Its navy escorts Allied ships through dangerous waters, hunts German raiders in the Pacific, and protects trade routes across Asia. But every move is strategic. Every act of service earns Japan leverage, not just territory, but respect, or at least the illusion of it. Yet in Tokyo, the ambitions grow darker. The government begins drafting secret plans, how to use the chaos of Europe's war to reshape Asia's balance of power. The whispers grow louder. China is weak. Europe is distracted. Now is the time. For the Japanese people, the war brings a strange mix of pride and confusion. They're told their nation is fighting for honor and alliance, but few understand why no Japanese soldiers are dying in Europe. Factories boom. Newspapers praise the emperor's wisdom, and yet, beneath the patriotic fervor, a quiet question lingers. What happens when the war ends? Because the truth is, Japan doesn't just want to win a war. It wants to win recognition. It wants a seat at the table where the fate of nations will be decided. It wants to prove that the rising sun shines just as bright as any flag in the West. But history, as we'll soon see, had other plans. Japan's entrance into World War I wasn't a story of loyalty. It was a calculated move cloaked in duty. It marked the beginning of Japan's transformation from a regional power into a global one. But it also planted the seeds of mistrust, resentment and betrayal that would grow for decades to come. Because behind the polite diplomacy and formal declarations, Japan's leaders were playing a far longer game, one that would change the future of Asia forever. If you thought Japan's alliance with Britain was one of friendship and equality, think again. What began as cooperation would soon reveal its darker side: manipulation, suspicion, and secret agendas. When we think of alliances in history, we often imagine partnerships built on trust, shared values, and mutual respect. But the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 was nothing like that. It was not a friendship. It was a deal born out of necessity, suspicion, and quiet self-interest. Britain wanted a guard in the East. Japan wanted recognition from the West. And both sides knew exactly how fragile that arrangement was. At the turn of the 20th century, Britain was stretched thin. Its empire spanned the globe: India, Africa, Australia, but its navy couldn't be everywhere at once. The British feared one thing above all: Russian expansion into Asia. Meanwhile, Japan, newly modernized and eager to prove its strength, was looking for a way to secure legitimacy among Western powers. When the two nations shook hands in 1902, it was less about friendship and more about survival. Britain saw Japan as a useful sword to keep Russia in check. Japan saw Britain as the key to global respect. Here's the truth that history books often skip: the alliance was always one-sided. Britain treated Japan as a tool, a convenient partner in a dangerous region. They never intended to see Japan as equal. Yet, in Japan, the alliance was seen as a triumph. Newspapers celebrated it as the nation's formal acceptance into the club of civilized powers. Diplomats toasted to partnership, but behind the champagne smiles, both sides were calculating. For Japan, this alliance meant far more than Britain could imagine. It was validation after decades of effort. After defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905, Japan had proven its might. Now, with Britain's signature on a treaty, Japan believed it had finally earned its place beside the empires that once looked down on it. But there was something else stirring beneath the pride, a quiet realization that even this alliance came with chains. When World War I began, Britain invoked the alliance and asked Japan to assist against Germany's navy in the Pacific. Japan agreed quickly, not out of loyalty, but because they understood what this war could offer. While Britain fought for survival in Europe, Japan saw a chance to expand influence in Asia with minimal Western interference. They could seize German colonies, occupy strategic ports, and rewrite the balance of power in the Pacific, all while claiming to defend their allies' interests. The British diplomats smiled in public, but in private they were wary. They needed Japan's navy, but they feared Japan's ambition. Reports from British officers in Asia spoke of Japanese forces growing rapidly, of flags rising over once German islands, of troops landing in Chinese ports. It was clear that Japan wasn't just fighting Germany, it was building an empire under the cover of war. Imagine the irony. While Britain and Japan exchanged polite telegrams of mutual gratitude, both were watching the other's every move. In Tokyo, British advisors were welcomed into naval headquarters, but never shown too much. In London, officials praised Japan's loyalty, even as they whispered fears that Japan might one day turn its guns westward. The alliance that began as cooperation slowly became a game of shadows, two powers smiling for the cameras while hiding knives behind their backs. The Western world didn't talk about it, but Japan understood the deeper insult. Even as an ally, they were never seen as equals. In British high society, Japanese diplomats were treated as curiosities, polite, exotic guests who were still not quite European. The racism that underpinned Western imperialism never disappeared, even in alliance, and Japan noticed every formal dinner, every treaty negotiation, every carefully chosen word, reminded them that, no matter how hard they tried, they would never be fully accepted by the West. That quiet humiliation began to harden into resolve. Japan would play along for now, they would help Britain, they would secure victories, they would act the perfect ally. But when the time came, they would no longer ask for respect, they would demand it. By 1915, as Japan's power expanded across the Pacific, the alliance began to crack. Britain realized that the more territory Japan took, the harder it would be to contain them later. Yet, they couldn't risk losing their only reliable ally in the East. So they said nothing. They allowed Japan to move further into Chinese lands, to occupy German possessions, and to grow stronger with every passing month. It was a decision that would haunt them later. To the public, the Anglo-Japanese alliance looked like a symbol of international cooperation. But behind closed doors, it was a ticking time bomb built on mistrust, sustained by need, and destined to collapse under the weight of its own hypocrisy. And when Japan finally realized that Britain's friendship came with limits, they decided to rewrite the rules of Asia themselves. If you thought Japan joined World War I to support Britain, you're about to see the truth. Their next move wasn't just military. It was a warning to the world that Japan would no longer play by Western rules. When we think of Japan's military power, most people imagine the massive fleets of World War II, the thunder of aircraft carriers, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the rise of the empire. But decades before that, long before Japan became a household name in global warfare, there was a smaller, quieter moment that changed everything. The attack on Qingdao. Here's the part history rarely tells. Japan's first major act in World War I wasn't in Europe, but in China. And it wasn't just a battle, it was a message, a declaration to the West that Japan was no longer content to stand in the shadows. In 1914, when Japan declared war on Germany, one target stood out: Qingdao, a port on China's Shandong Peninsula. To most Europeans, it was just another colonial outpost, a tiny speck on the map. But to Japan, Qingdao represented something far greater, a chance to prove that Asia would no longer be Europe's playground. For years, Germany had treated Qingdao as its personal fortress in the east. They had built railways, factories, and heavy defenses, claiming it as their little piece of Germany on Chinese soil. It was a symbol of Western arrogance, and Japan wanted to tear it down. Imagine the scene, August 1914. Japan's naval fleet, sleek and disciplined, cuts through the Pacific waters. The ships glisten under the rising sun, each flying the red circle of the imperial flag. On board, thousands of Japanese soldiers prepare in silence. Some are nervous, some proud, but all understand what's at stake. This isn't just about taking a city, it's about showing the world that Japan can do what no Asian power has ever done: defeat a European empire on its own ground. As Japan's ships surround Qingdao, British forces arrive, a small detachment sent to support the assault. But make no mistake, this is Japan's operation. Their commanders lead the siege. Their artillery fires the first shots. Their soldiers storm the hills. For 2 long months, explosions echo across the Shandong coast. The skies fill with smoke and iron. And here's the detail that makes it unforgettable. Japan didn't just fight with courage, they fought with precision. Their army dug trenches like the Europeans. Their artillery was modern and deadly. Their navy blocked every German escape route. Even the British officers watching from a distance were stunned. One of them later wrote, "The Japanese conduct war like a machine, efficient, relentless and frighteningly modern." When Qingdao finally fell in November 1914, the world barely noticed. Europe was drowning in blood, and newspapers had little space for an Asian victory. But in Tokyo, the celebrations were overwhelming. Bells rang in temples, crowds gathered in the streets. Soldiers returned home to banners and music. The emperor himself sent personal commendations to the officers who led the siege. Japan had done what it set out to do, defeated a European empire in Asia. It wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. For centuries, the West had seen Asia as a place to conquer. Now, for the first time, an Asian power had taken something back. But behind the pride, Japan's leaders were already thinking several steps ahead. They knew that simply winning Qingdao wasn't enough. The real prize wasn't land, it was influence. With Germany's colonies in the Pacific left undefended, Japan began quietly occupying them. The Marshall Islands, the Marianas, the Carolines, each new flag planted in the sand marked another step toward dominance in the Pacific. The British didn't protest. Not yet. They needed Japan's navy too much. But inside London's war offices, unease was growing. Reports showed that Japan wasn't stopping. They were expanding, consolidating, building bases, and securing trade routes, all under the polite excuse of protecting Allied interests. Britain had created a partner that was becoming too powerful to control. In China, things grew even more tense. Japan refused to return Qingdao to Chinese authority, despite claiming it was only protecting the region from Germany. Chinese newspapers began calling Japan's actions imperialism in disguise. But Japan ignored them. They believed they had earned the right to shape Asia's future, and no one, not even China, would stop them. What made this moment so significant was not just the victory itself, but what it revealed about Japan's mindset. They had tasted success, and with it came something more intoxicating: belief. The belief that Japan's destiny was to lead Asia, to stand above its neighbors, to command the respect of the Western world through strength, not diplomacy. Yet in the shadows of that triumph, a dangerous arrogance began to grow. The same pride that fueled Japan's modernization now began to twist into something darker, the idea that only domination could earn respect. Qingdao was the first step. The world barely noticed, but those who did, the generals, the diplomats, the imperial planners, understood exactly what it meant. Japan had entered the global stage, not as a follower, but as a challenger, and the world was not ready for what would come next. If you thought Japan's ambitions ended with Qingdao, you're mistaken. The victory had emboldened them to aim higher, not just at land, but at power itself. Their next move would no longer be on the battlefield, but in the meeting rooms of China, where a series of demands would expose just how far Japan was willing to go to reshape Asia's destiny. Next up, the 21 demands, Japan's hidden agenda in China, the secret ultimatum that turned allies into enemies and changed the balance of power in Asia forever. The victory at Qingdao had given Japan more than territory. It had given them confidence, the kind of confidence that makes empires ambitious, and ambition that soon turns into hunger. Japan had proven its military strength, but now it wanted something far greater: control. Not through war, but through diplomacy disguised as friendship. And its next target was China. By 1915, Europe was burning. The Great War consumed every ounce of British, French, and German attention. The Western powers were too distracted to notice what Japan was quietly doing in the East. In Tokyo, government ministers met behind closed doors. Maps of China stretched across tables. Advisors whispered about opportunity, the perfect time to secure dominance over Asia, while the West was too busy fighting itself. So Japan crafted a plan, a bold and secret one, known as the 21 Demands. On paper, it looked like a list of requests to strengthen friendship and cooperation with China. In reality, it was an ultimatum, one that would have turned China into Japan's puppet state. The document was divided into 5 groups. Each group represented another chain around China's sovereignty. The first few demands were predictable. Japan wanted to inherit Germany's rights in Shandong, to control the railways, mines, and trade there. But as the list went on, it grew darker. Japan wanted full control of Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. They wanted to station Japanese advisors inside China's police, military, and political institutions. They wanted Chinese industries to prioritize Japanese companies. And most shocking of all, they wanted influence over China's government itself. Imagine the pressure on Chinese President Yuan Shikai. His nation was weak, fragmented, and exhausted from internal revolts. Foreign powers had been carving it up for decades, and now Japan, supposedly an ally of the Allies, was tightening the rope. Japan's diplomats delivered the demands in January 1915, along with a clear threat: accept or face consequences. China hesitated, hoping the Western nations would intervene. But the world was too busy with the trenches of Europe to care about a diplomatic crisis in Asia. Britain and France offered words, nothing more. Even the United States, which often preached about protecting China's independence, remained silent. Japan knew it, and pressed harder. Behind the scenes, Japanese newspapers were told to remain quiet, while in China panic spread. Protests erupted in cities. Students marched, chanting slogans against Japanese imperialism. Merchants boycotted Japanese goods. For the first time, ordinary Chinese people began to unite around a shared fear: the loss of their nation. In May 1915, under unbearable pressure, Yuan Shikai gave in. He accepted most of the 21 demands, hoping to save what little independence China had left. When news broke, Japan celebrated it as a diplomatic victory. Tokyo's officials called it a new era of Asian cooperation, but across China, the streets filled with fury. The humiliation was too great to ignore. The phrase "national shame of 1915" became a rallying cry for generations to come. Yet, there was another side to this story, the one that never made the headlines. Inside Japan, not everyone agreed with these actions. Some politicians and thinkers feared that Japan was losing its soul. that in its rush for empire, it was becoming the very thing it once fought against, an oppressor. But those voices were drowned out by the thunder of nationalism. Japan's leaders believed they were destined to lead Asia, even if it meant subjugating their neighbors. The Western powers finally took notice, and they didn't like what they saw. Britain, in particular, began to question Japan's loyalty. The Anglo-Japanese alliance had been useful, but now it looked dangerous. The idea of a powerful Japan dominating China threatened not only Britain's economic interests, but also the fragile balance of power in the Pacific. Diplomats began whispering about restraining Japan once the war was over. But for Japan, there was no turning back. The success of the 21 demands had shown them a new kind of power, one that didn't require armies, only signatures. It was empire through ink and intimidation. However, what Japan failed to see was the long-term cost of this victory. In trying to control China, they had awakened a new enemy, not a nation but a movement. Chinese nationalism began to rise, fueled by resentment toward Japan. Students, workers, intellectuals, all united by one idea: China must stand on its own again. This spark would later ignite revolutions, wars, and the deep-rooted mistrust that would define East Asia for decades. For Japan, though, the gamble seemed worth it. They had expanded their influence, silenced China, and faced no punishment from the West. The plan had worked, or so it seemed. But history has a way of revealing the cracks behind every empire's triumph. Because while Japan was tightening its grip on Asia, its Western allies were starting to see through the mask. The polite diplomacy, the promises of partnership, the image of a loyal ally, all began to crumble. Behind the scenes, the Western powers began to ask themselves a dangerous question: was Japan still an ally or a threat? The answer would come soon enough, because as Japan's ambitions grew, the very allies it had helped in the Great War would begin to fear it. In the smoke and chaos of World War I, few in the West had time to look eastward. Europe was tearing itself apart. Every newspaper headline screamed of battles in France, Belgium, and the Balkans. But beneath that noise, Japan's quiet maneuvers in Asia had begun to unsettle the great powers. They had asked for an ally and created a rival. At first, Britain and its partners viewed Japan's victories as convenient. Japan's navy patrolled the Pacific, keeping German raiders away from trade routes. Their capture of Qingdao had saved Britain the trouble of sending more troops to the Far East. On paper, it all looked like loyalty. But by 1916, British intelligence reports began painting a different picture, one that made London uneasy. Japan wasn't just supporting the Allied cause, it was expanding under the cover of it. In private meetings, British diplomats muttered words like overreach and ambition. They saw Japan taking control of former German islands, building naval bases, and enforcing its will on China. The language of alliance began to sound hollow. Japan's help came with invisible strings, strings that could one day choke Britain's own colonial interests. The press caught wind of it too. In London and New York, editorials began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why was Japan holding on to Qingdao? Why were they issuing ultimatums to China during a world war? Wasn't this the kind of imperial aggression the Allies claimed to be fighting against? Japan's diplomats worked hard to control the narrative. They described their actions as maintaining regional stability. They argued that Asia needed order, and who better to provide it than Japan, a civilized, modern, industrial nation standing beside the West. To many it sounded reasonable, but behind the polished speeches, resentment brewed. The Americans were especially wary. President Woodrow Wilson had long promoted the idea of self-determination, that nations should govern themselves, free from foreign domination. Japan's 21 demands on China violated everything that ideal stood for. US newspapers accused Japan of acting as the Germany of the East. It was a stinging comparison, and not entirely wrong. Meanwhile, Britain found itself trapped. The Anglo-Japanese alliance, signed in 1902, was meant to protect mutual interests in Asia, particularly against Russia. But the war had changed everything. Now Japan's power in the Pacific was growing too fast. British colonies like Hong Kong, Singapore, and India suddenly seemed more vulnerable. The empire had armed a tiger, and that tiger was learning to hunt. There were secret discussions inside the Foreign Office about how to contain Japan after the war. One memo from 1917 warned, Japan's assistance, though presently valuable, may one day present greater danger to the stability of His Majesty's possessions than any foe. But for the time being, Britain could do nothing. They needed Japan's ships, and Japan knew it. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Okuma Shigenobu and his advisors read Western doubts as proof that Japan was finally being taken seriously. To them, suspicion wasn't an insult, it was respect. For centuries, Western powers had dismissed Asian nations as weak or inferior. Now they were cautious, even afraid. That fear was intoxicating. It told Japan that it had crossed the invisible line separating East and West, that it had become one of the great powers, but respect bought through fear is fragile. Japan's ambitions in China and the Pacific began to alienate even its closest allies. When Japanese diplomats pressed for recognition of their new territories, Britain and the US delayed, deflected, or ignored the requests. The smiles at meetings grew thinner, the handshakes more forced. Then came the Siberian intervention, a moment that pushed the uneasy alliance to its limits. In 1918, as the Russian Empire collapsed into revolution, chaos spread across Siberia. The Allies decided to send troops to restore order and support anti-Bolshevik forces. Japan offered to help, but their version of help would reveal far more about their ambitions than their loyalty. Because this time, Japan wouldn't just send a few ships or regiments, they would send an army. Tens of thousands of soldiers marching into Russia's Far East under the banner of an ally, but with plans of their own. The West watched carefully, unsure of what Japan truly wanted. They would soon find out that this wasn't just an act of cooperation. It was the next stage of Japan's plan to expand its reach, seize new lands, and cement itself as the undisputed power of the Pacific. And this, the Siberian campaign, would be the moment the mask began to slip. By 1918, the world was bleeding. The trenches of Europe had consumed millions, and empires trembled under the weight of exhaustion. But far from the Western Front, a different kind of war was unfolding. One fought in shadows, in snow, and in silence. Japan called it assistance. History would later call it something else entirely. When the Russian Empire collapsed after the Bolshevik Revolution, Siberia descended into chaos. The Trans-Siberian Railway, once a symbol of imperial power, became a lifeline for stranded armies, fleeing civilians, and treasure trains carrying gold, weapons, and secrets. The Allies feared that Germany might exploit the turmoil, or worse, that Bolshevik ideology might spread eastward, infecting Asia with revolution. So they needed stability, and Japan was eager to provide it. On paper, Japan's offer was simple: send a few thousand troops to safeguard Allied supply lines and rescue prisoners of war. But behind closed doors, Tokyo had a different plan. They saw Siberia not as a mission of mercy, but as an opportunity, a vast frozen frontier, rich in resources, weak in defense, and cut off from the West's watchful eyes. It was, in their view, the perfect testing ground for expansion. By August 1918, over 70,000 Japanese soldiers crossed into Siberia, far more than the few thousand requested by the Allies. Their presence dwarfed the small contingents sent by the United States, Britain, and Canada. Japan had turned a multinational expedition into a personal conquest, and once their boots hit the icy ground, they began to behave less like peacekeepers and more like occupiers. They seized railways, ports, and key towns under the guise of security. Local Russian leaders, already desperate and divided, found themselves negotiating not with allies, but with masters. Japanese officers dictated terms, commandeered supplies, and even began recruiting local militias, loyal to Tokyo's interests. It was a quiet colonization, carried out under the banner of alliance. The US soon caught on. American General William Graves, who commanded US forces in Siberia, wrote in frustration that Japan had no intention of leaving and was pursuing policies incompatible with Allied purpose. His soldiers, outnumbered 10-1, could do little but watch as Japan extended its influence deeper and deeper into Russian territory. Every mile they advanced, they built rail lines, fortified outposts, and extracted resources, not for the war effort, but for themselves. In Tokyo, the government denied any imperial motives. They claimed their soldiers were protecting stability and preventing Bolshevik infiltration. But Japanese businessmen and industrialists were quietly celebrating. The intervention opened access to Siberia's timber, coal and minerals, all crucial for Japan's growing industries. Military officers saw something else, strategic territory that could one day serve as a buffer zone against both Russia and Western interference. Yet, not everyone in Japan approved. The cost of the campaign was enormous. Tens of thousands of troops, months of supply lines, and brutal winter conditions drained the nation's resources. Many Japanese families saw their sons vanish into the frozen wilderness. For what? Newspapers began to question the government's motives. Was this truly about security or ambition? For the first time, cracks appeared in the illusion of unity that Japan's leaders so carefully maintained. Meanwhile, Western diplomats grew alarmed. Reports from Siberia described Japanese troops acting independently, ignoring Allied commands, even clashing with local forces. The British, already wary after Japan's expansion in China, began to fear they were witnessing the birth of a new imperial player, one that would soon challenge them across Asia. By 1922, the Siberian intervention had dragged on far longer than anyone expected. Most Allied forces had already withdrawn, weary and disillusioned. But Japan stayed. They refused to leave until they had secured every possible advantage. When they finally pulled out, under immense international pressure, they did so reluctantly, leaving behind networks of influence, puppet leaders, and a lingering sense of distrust that would haunt East-West relations for decades. But something deeper had changed within Japan itself. The Siberian adventure had emboldened a new generation of military leaders who believed Japan's destiny lay in domination, not diplomacy. Men who had marched through the snows of Siberia now returned home with a dangerous conviction that Japan was strong enough to act alone, that the West's hypocrisy had been exposed, and that Asia's future would belong not to Europe, but to Japan. It was the birth of an idea that would grow quietly in the shadows, the dream of a greater East Asia. An empire led not by white colonizers, but by Japan itself, justified as liberation, executed as conquest. The Siberian intervention was not a footnote. It was a rehearsal for Manchuria, for China, for everything that would come in the 1930s. And while the world turned its eyes back to Europe to celebrate the end of the Great War, Japan's soldiers marched home carrying a lesson that would change history forever, that the world's chaos was their opportunity. The war had given Japan legitimacy. Siberia had given it ambition, and now the empire was hungry. When the guns of World War I finally fell silent in November 1918, Europe was unrecognizable. Empires had collapsed, borders had blurred, millions were dead, and millions more were broken. But as the victors gathered in Paris to decide the world's future, one nation arrived with its head held high: Japan. They hadn't fought in the trenches of France or lost legions of soldiers on the Western Front, but they had something else: success, stability, and ambition. And for the first time in modern history, an Asian nation was taking its place at the table of world power. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was meant to shape a new, fairer world, one based on justice, equality, and peace. At least, that's what the speeches promised. Behind closed doors, it was still about old empires carving up new territories. Japan understood this perfectly. They had come not as idealists, but as realists. They wanted recognition, respect, and reward. Their delegation, led by Makino Nobuaki and Saionji Kinmochi, entered the ornate halls of Versailles knowing exactly what they wanted: the former German territories in China's Shandong province, the Pacific Islands north of the equator, and, most daringly, the acknowledgement that all nations, regardless of race, were equal. That last demand would become one of the most explosive in diplomatic history. The racial equality clause was a bold move. Japan proposed that the League of Nations, the new organization meant to preserve peace, should include a statement affirming the equality of all nations and peoples. It was, in spirit, a simple request, but it struck at the very foundation of the world order. For centuries, Western empires had thrived on hierarchy: white above brown, Christian above heathen, colonizer above colonized. Japan's proposal was a direct challenge to that hypocrisy. When the idea was first presented, it gained surprising support. France, Italy, and several smaller nations agreed that it was only fair. Even President Woodrow Wilson of the United States, at least publicly, seemed open to the principle. But behind the polite smiles, resistance was brewing. Britain worried about how such a clause would play in its colonies, where millions of non-white subjects were denied equality. Australia's Prime Minister Billy Hughes was blunt. He warned that such a statement would threaten his country's White Australia immigration policy. And Wilson, ever cautious, feared backlash from America's deeply segregated South. So when the vote finally came, Japan's clause received a majority, but Wilson declared it failed, claiming that such a proposal needed unanimous approval. It was a technical excuse for a moral failure. Japan's delegates were stunned. They had fought as allies, contributed ships, men and money, yet when they asked for equality, they were told the world wasn't ready. The humiliation burned deeply. Shanji later wrote that Japan had entered Versailles as an ally and left as an inferior. The Western powers' message was clear: Japan could sit at the table, but only as long as it remembered its place. Still, Japan didn't leave empty-handed. They secured the territories they wanted: the Pacific Islands, once held by Germany, and control over Shandong in China. But even those victories carried a bitter taste. China, which had fought alongside the Allies, protested furiously. Chinese students took to the streets in what became known as the May 4th movement, denouncing both Japan and the Western powers for betraying their sovereignty. Japan's image in Asia began to shift from liberator to occupier. Inside Japan, the Versailles outcome triggered a mix of pride and resentment. On one hand, they were now recognized as a global power, seated among the world's elite. On the other, they saw the truth of Western hypocrisy laid bare. The talk of freedom and justice meant nothing if your skin wasn't white. This realization hardened Japan's foreign policy. The dream of partnership with the West began to fade, replaced by a new conviction: if respect could not be earned through cooperation, it would be taken through strength. In the years that followed, that seed of resentment would grow into a movement, the idea that Japan must create its own destiny, free from Western dominance. The Siberian snows had shown Japan what it could do. Versailles showed Japan what it could never be allowed to become. Back in Tokyo, nationalists seized the moment. Newspapers decried the hypocrisy of the peace conference. Politicians called for a new Asia led by Japan. The people, still proud of their nation's modernization and military might, began to believe that perhaps their destiny was not to be accepted by the West, but to surpass it. In that gilded hall in Versailles, as Western diplomats toasted victory and redivided the world, something far greater had been set in motion. Japan's frustration and wounded pride would echo for decades, shaping its path toward imperial expansion, conflict, and tragedy. The world thought peace had been signed. In truth, a new kind of war, one of ideology and identity, had just begun. The ink on the Treaty of Versailles was barely dry, but for Japan, the lesson was already carved deep. Equality was never given. It had to be taken. The Versailles Conference had ended, but the wounds it left on Japan's pride ran deeper than any scar of war. In the grand halls of Europe, Japan had finally stood shoulder to shoulder with the Western powers, only to realize they were never meant to stand as equals. The message was silent but unmistakable. Japan could help win the war, but it could never be one of them. And that single insult, cloaked in diplomacy and double standards, would change the course of Japan's destiny. The rejection of the racial equality clause was more than political, it was personal. Across Japan, newspapers carried headlines of humiliation. Students at universities discussed how their nation's honor had been trampled. Editorials condemned the hypocrisy of a West that spoke of liberty while still holding millions under colonial rule. For many Japanese, it felt like betrayal, a reminder that, no matter how much they modernized, the West still viewed them as outsiders in the so-called civilized world. But it wasn't just anger. It was awakening. In Tokyo, a new generation of thinkers began to question everything they had been taught about Western superiority. For decades, Japan had modeled itself after Europe. Its armies, its industries, even its manners. Now they saw that imitation would never bring acceptance. The international order was just another empire, one built on color and power, not justice. And if Japan wanted true respect, it would have to build its own order, on its own terms. The resentment deepened when the US passed the Immigration Act of 1924, banning Japanese immigrants entirely. America, once seen as a partner, now slammed the door shut. It wasn't about economics, it was about race. Japan's newspapers erupted in outrage. "They fear us," one headline read. "They cannot accept the rise of the East." The people felt humiliated once again, and the government took note. Western racism was no longer an abstract insult. It was policy. It was exclusion, codified into law. And, for a nation obsessed with honor and dignity, this was a blow too sharp to forget. The government responded with determination cloaked in calm. They continued to trade, to sign treaties, to speak of cooperation. But underneath that diplomacy burned a quiet anger, a promise whispered in the corridors of power: "We will not bow again." Military leaders began to rise in influence. Men hardened by the Siberian snow and the lessons of Versailles preached a simple idea: that Japan could no longer trust the West. They argued that diplomacy was just another weapon used to contain them, to keep them weak, to deny them the respect they deserved, and the people, still proud of their nation's transformation from isolation to industrial power, began to believe it. Every insult, every rejection, every racist headline in Western papers became fuel for nationalism. Japan's schools began teaching not just science and discipline, but destiny. The idea that Japan had a divine mission to lead Asia out of Western oppression. What had started as a cry for equality turned into a vision of superiority. If the world would not treat Japan as equal, Japan would make itself the center of a new world, an empire of its own. Even artists and writers joined the cause. Novels and plays spoke of Japan's unique spirit, its unmatched resilience, its divine lineage. The West was portrayed as corrupt, decaying and morally bankrupt, while Japan was cast as pure, honorable and destined to restore balance. These stories comforted a nation nursing an invisible wound. But behind the pride was pain, a kind of quiet humiliation that the West never noticed. Japan had believed in the promise of progress, of fairness, of shared humanity. Versailles had exposed the lie, and when a proud nation is humiliated, it doesn't forget. It transforms. The world thought Japan's fury would fade with time. It didn't. It fermented, slow, silent and poisonous. Every act of Western arrogance, every patronizing remark, every treaty that treated Japan as lesser, added another drop to the cup. And soon that cup would overflow, because resentment once mixed with ambition becomes dangerous. It stops asking for recognition and starts demanding revenge. By the late 1920s, Japan's resentment had evolved into strategy. The government spoke less of cooperation, more of independence. The military whispered of destiny, expansion, and resources. The seeds planted at Versailles, watered by racism, arrogance, and exclusion, were now taking root. The West had underestimated Japan. They thought humiliation would keep it obedient. Instead, it gave Japan purpose, and that purpose would soon take form in an invasion that would shock the world and set the stage for an empire that believed it was righting the wrongs of history. The stage was set. The dream of equality had died. In its place, something far more dangerous was born. The year was 1931. The world was still reeling from the Great Depression. Nations bankrupt, people starving, governments desperate, and in the midst of that chaos, Japan made its move. On the cold plains of Manchuria, a single explosion lit up the night, small, almost insignificant, but that blast on a remote railway line near Mukden would ignite a fire that would consume Asia for the next 15 years. Japan claimed it was sabotage. They blamed Chinese nationalists for attacking their South Manchurian railway. But behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. The explosion was staged by Japan's own army. It was an excuse, a carefully planned spark, to justify invasion. Within hours, Japanese troops poured into Manchuria. Within days, they had seized entire cities, and within weeks they declared the birth of a new puppet state. Manchukuo, the world watched in shock. But Japan's newspapers celebrated. The empire expands. The headlines screamed. The soldiers were heroes. The invasion was framed as liberation, not conquest. Japan claimed it was protecting Manchuria from chaos, bringing order where China had failed. It was the same argument European empires had used for centuries, only this time it was the East using the language of the West. For Japan, Manchuria was more than land. It was validation, proof that they could act without permission, that they could rewrite the rules of power. The industrialists saw endless resources, coal, iron, land, and labor. The army saw glory, a chance to avenge the slights of Versailles and build an empire that rivaled Britain's. But deep beneath that pride lay something darker: fear. Japan's population was growing, its economy strained. The military believed survival required expansion. The West had colonies, so why shouldn't Japan? Asia for the Asians, they said. But the meaning twisted. It no longer meant liberation from colonialism, it meant domination under a new master. Inside Japan, opposition was silenced. When Prime Minister Wakatsuki tried to rein in the military, they ignored him. The civilian government had lost control. The army no longer asked for permission, it simply acted. Officers justified every move as loyalty to the emperor, even if the emperor himself hadn't approved. It was the birth of a new Japan, one ruled not by politicians, but by soldiers. The same army that had once fought in Europe as an ally of the West was now turning its back on everything that alliance had stood for. In Tokyo, the public adored their troops. The Manchurian campaign was presented as destiny fulfilled. Films, songs, and school books told the same story. Japan had brought peace to a troubled land. But the truth on the ground was far from peaceful. Cities burned. Villages were empty. Anyone who resisted the new order disappeared. And yet, when the League of Nations sent investigators to uncover the truth, Japan refused to back down. They condemned the League's report as biased. When the League voted to reject Japan's conquest, Japan simply walked out. In that moment, Japan officially left the international order it had once tried so hard to join. The country that had fought beside Britain and the US in World War I was now alone, and proud of it. To many in Japan, the withdrawal from the League wasn't shame, it was freedom. They believed they had been shackled by Western hypocrisy for too long. Now they would define their own morality, their own justice, their own empire. Newspapers called it the rebirth of Japan. Generals called it divine destiny. And the people, weary of global disrespect, believed it. But the rest of the world saw something else. A warning. A once respectable ally had become unpredictable. The West had created Japan in its own image. Industrial, militarized, ambitious. And now that creation was turning against its maker, it wasn't just about Manchuria anymore. It was about the future of Asia, and whether Japan's hunger for respect would swallow peace entirely. Behind the propaganda, Japan's leaders knew the risks. They had defied the West and exposed its weakness. No nation dared to stop them. Britain protested but did nothing. America condemned but stayed out. The League of Nations talked but acted not at all. And that silence was permission. Japan had tested the world, and the world had failed the test. That silence told Japan one thing: they could go further. For a nation that once sought validation, this was intoxicating. Power had replaced pride. Expansion had replaced equality. The dream of being accepted by the West had died in Versailles, and now Japan dreamed of ruling the East instead. The transformation was complete. What began as an effort to stand among equals had become a mission to dominate. The Manchurian invasion was not just the start of Japan's empire, it was a warning to the world. A warning that humiliation breeds hunger, that a nation ignored long enough will not ask for respect, it will take it. And as Japan tightened its grip on Manchuria, the world began to understand, too late, that what they had dismissed as a regional conflict was the spark of something far greater, something that would soon drag the world back into the flames. The irony of history is cruel. 2 decades earlier, Japan had fought side by side with Britain and the United States, wearing the same colors, raising the same flags, bleeding for the same victory. But by the 1930s, those very allies had become rivals, their friendship replaced by suspicion, fear, and quiet hostility. The world Japan had once fought to protect now looked at it as the threat. And Japan, tired of humiliation and hypocrisy, began to see betrayal everywhere. To understand how deep that betrayal ran, we have to go back to the promises made during World War I and the ones broken after it. Japan had stood loyal to the Allied cause, seizing German colonies in the Pacific, protecting trade routes, and helping crush the Central Powers. In return, it expected what every ally did: respect, recognition, and a seat at the table of great powers. But at Versailles, that expectation had been shattered. Japan was treated as useful, not equal. It had fought like a lion, but was spoken to like a servant. The scars of that humiliation lingered in every speech, every headline, every soldier's oath. By the 1930s, the West saw Japan's expansion into Manchuria as aggression, but Japan saw it as survival. Britain and the US controlled half the planet through colonies, yet they condemned Japan for seeking resources next door. The double standard was impossible to ignore. Why is it empire when they do it, but aggression when we do? Japanese officers asked, and in that question lay the justification for everything that followed. Still, Japan tried for a time to maintain balance. Trade continued. Diplomats spoke of peace. But every year, the gap widened. The Western press painted Japan as brutal, expansionist, dangerous, the new Germany of the East. And while Hitler was rising in Europe, Japan was being quietly cornered in Asia. The United States began limiting exports of steel and oil to Japan, the lifeblood of its growing empire. Britain tightened its grip on the Pacific trade routes. Australia and Canada echoed America's warnings. To Japan, it looked like a siege, a slow strangling by the same nations that had once called them comrades. Inside Tokyo, the military's voice grew louder. The admirals spoke of encirclement, the generals spoke of destiny. They argued that the West would never allow Japan to grow strong, that every treaty, every sanction, every diplomatic gesture was meant to keep them in chains. The civilian politicians who still believed in diplomacy were mocked as weak. "You cannot negotiate with those who look down on you," one colonel said. "You must make them look up." The sense of betrayal became a national fever. In schools, children learned of the Western powers' hypocrisy. Textbooks described Japan as the true protector of Asia, destined to liberate it from colonial oppression. The same nation that once admired Western civilization now saw it as a disease, greedy, deceitful, and doomed. And when the West condemned Japan's actions, the propaganda machine turned it into proof. "They fear us because we are strong," it proclaimed. But the betrayal ran both ways. The West had its own fears, not without reason. Japan's invasion of China in 1937, its defiance of the League of Nations, and its growing military power terrified policymakers in London and Washington. They remembered the old alliance, but could no longer recognize the ally. The Japan they once knew, modern, polite, cooperative, had transformed into something colder, sharper, and unpredictable. To them, Japan's ambitions looked eerily familiar, the same hunger for dominance that had once driven Germany before the Great War, and yet neither side understood the other anymore. Japan saw hypocrisy, the West saw danger. Japan saw survival, the West saw aggression. Both were right and both were wrong. By 1939, with Europe consumed by a second war, Japan saw opportunity. Germany, the very enemy Japan had fought in 1914, was now its partner. The tripartite pact with Germany and Italy marked Japan's final break from its old allies. The signatures on that document were more than ink. They were a declaration that Japan no longer needed Western approval. The empire had chosen its side and its destiny, but behind the triumphal speeches and parades, not everyone in Japan celebrated. Some diplomats whispered that aligning with fascist Europe was a dangerous gamble. Older politicians remembered the friendship with Britain and the United States and wondered if there was still time to turn back. But the army no longer listened. It had found a new faith, not in cooperation, but in confrontation. As the 1930s came to a close, Japan's ships sailed farther, its armies marched deeper into China, and its rhetoric grew sharper. The nation that once dreamed of equality now dreamed of supremacy. The empire was rising, not with applause from its former allies, but with silence, suspicion, and fear. The echoes of betrayal that began in Versailles were now thundering across the Pacific. Japan had learned the lessons of the West: conquest, empire, dominance, and was now ready to teach them back in its own brutal language. The world that had once excluded Japan was about to face the consequences of doing so, and when the first bombs would fall a few years later, that long history of betrayal would explode into the most devastating conflict humanity had ever seen. By the end of the 1930s, Japan stood at a crossroads, torn between two visions of its own destiny. One looked backward to the ideals of Bushido, the samurai code of loyalty, honor, and discipline. The other looked forward toward empire, industry, and dominance over Asia. What began as a struggle for dignity after World War I had now become a quest for power at any cost. Japan was no longer fighting for recognition, it was fighting for control, and in that transformation, everything changed. The seeds of this transformation had been planted decades earlier, but now they were bearing their most dangerous fruit. The Meiji dream of modernization had once been about survival, catching up with the West to avoid colonization, but by 1940 the dream had darkened. The new generation of leaders no longer wanted to imitate the West. They wanted to replace it. The same ships and guns once built for defense were now tools of expansion. The same ideals of honor and sacrifice were now fuel for conquest. At the heart of this shift was the belief that Japan was destined to lead all of Asia. The phrase "Asia for Asians" became the rallying cry. It sounded noble, even liberating, a call to free the East from centuries of Western domination. But beneath that slogan lay something far more sinister. Japan didn't just want to free Asia, it wanted to rule it. The invasion of China in 1937 had already revealed the brutality of this ambition. Cities like Nanjing burned, millions of civilians suffered, and the world watched in horror. Yet in Japan, the propaganda painted a different picture. Not one of destruction, but of divine purpose. Posters and radio broadcasts told the people that Japan was bringing order to chaos, light to darkness, civilization to the uncivilized. The word liberation became a mask for occupation, and the people believed it, or at least they wanted to. After years of humiliation from the West, Japan's rise felt like redemption. The newspapers were filled with victories. Soldiers returning from the front were hailed as heroes. Children in schools learned to bow toward the emperor's portrait and chant that Japan's destiny was to rule the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. It was no longer just politics, it was faith. The emperor himself, once a distant symbol, now became divine. His image appeared in homes, schools, and military camps. Every Japanese soldier marched with the belief that dying for him was the highest honor. The Bushido Code, once a moral guide for individual warriors, was twisted into a tool of mass control. Personal honor no longer meant living with virtue, it meant dying with obedience. This was the moment Japan's soul began to fracture. The same values that once made it strong, loyalty, courage, sacrifice, were now being used to justify unimaginable cruelty. The line between duty and destruction blurred. Conquest became sacred. Violence became virtue. And questioning authority became treason. Inside Japan, dissent disappeared. Journalists were silenced, professors arrested, artists censored. The government tightened its grip on thought itself. The nation became a single organism, one mind, one purpose, one emperor. And as war swept through Europe, Japan saw its chance. The Western powers were distracted, exhausted, divided. For the first time in history, Japan could move without interference. But there was a darker reason behind Japan's urgency: desperation. The empire it had built depended on resources: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron from China. Yet, by 1940, Western sanctions were choking those supplies. Japan's expansion wasn't just ambition anymore, it was survival. Every general, every admiral, every minister knew it. Without war, the empire would starve. And so the path became clear. If diplomacy meant humiliation and sanctions meant death, then war became the only answer. The strategy was simple and terrifying. Strike fast, strike hard, and take everything before the West could react. The Pacific, once seen as a barrier, was now a battlefield waiting to happen. Behind closed doors, Japanese leaders debated one last time. Could they really fight the United States, the world's industrial giant? Some argued it was madness. Others said it was destiny. One admiral famously warned, "For 6 months, we can run wild. After that, I can promise nothing." But his warning was ignored. Pride had taken control. By 1941, Japan's transformation was complete. The nation that had once joined the Allies in the name of peace had now become a military empire preparing for total war. Its soldiers prayed not for victory, but for glorious death. Its leaders spoke not of coexistence, but of domination. Its people no longer saw themselves as victims of history. They saw themselves as its authors. The drums of war were beating louder every day, and as Japan's warships set sail across the Pacific, few realized how close the world was to the edge of catastrophe. The final step in Japan's transformation, the one that would forever change global history, was about to begin. A single strike would turn ambition into apocalypse and forever rewrite Japan's place in the world. It's strange to think that a war meant to end all wars planted the seeds for the next, but that's exactly what happened. The story of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 doesn't begin with the bombs. It begins with betrayal, with broken promises made at the end of World War I. The world had told Japan, "Fight with us, prove yourself, and you'll be treated as an equal." But when the smoke cleared in 1918, Japan stood at the table of victory and was quietly pushed aside. The West got its glory. Japan got its resentment. And resentment, when left to rot, becomes rage. To understand why Japan struck that morning in December, you have to trace the emotions that had been building for decades. After World War I, Japan had tasted power. It had defeated Germany's Pacific forces, expanded its influence, and expected respect from its allies. But at the Versailles Peace Conference, it was denied the one thing it wanted most: recognition as an equal race among nations. When Japan proposed a racial equality clause, it was rejected by Britain, by America, by the very allies it had fought beside. That wound cut deep. It wasn't just about policy, it was about pride. Japan had proven it could fight, govern, modernize. Yet, in the eyes of the West, It was still other, still Asian, still lesser. That humiliation, buried under decades of polite diplomacy, festered into something far more dangerous, a belief that Japan could never rely on anyone but itself. And so it began to build an empire, first to secure resources, then to secure respect. But the more Japan expanded, the more the West pushed back. Sanctions tightened, oil shipments stopped. Every move Japan made to survive was met with another blockade, another warning, another lecture from the same powers who had carved up the world for themselves. To Tokyo, it wasn't just politics, it was hypocrisy. They call us aggressors, one general said, while they hold half the planet in chains. By 1940, the pattern was clear. Japan would never be accepted, only contained. Every diplomat knew it. Every soldier felt it, and every headline confirmed it. Japan's leaders saw two choices: submit or strike, and submission to them meant death. So they began to plan the unthinkable. The lessons of World War I guided every decision. The admirals studied Europe's mistakes, the slow mobilizations, the wasted years of trench warfare, and decided Japan would never fight that kind of war. They would hit first, hard, fast. They would cripple their enemies before they could even wake up. They would win not by endurance, but by shock. In the months leading to Pearl Harbor, Japan's strategy was wrapped in secrecy. The public heard only patriotic slogans: Asia for Asians, honor before surrender, the rising sun cannot be stopped. Behind the scenes, though, the truth was colder. Japan knew it couldn't win a long war against America, but it believed that one massive strike, one that shattered US morale, could force a truce, leaving Japan free to dominate Asia. It was a gamble not of strength, but of desperation. The men who planned the attack were haunted by the ghosts of World War I. Admiral Yamamoto, who once studied in the United States and admired its culture, warned his superiors that America's industrial might was unbeatable. Yet even he agreed to lead the mission, knowing what it meant. He said quietly to a friend, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for 6 months, but after that, I can promise nothing." His words were not prophecy, they were truth. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched its surprise assault on Pearl Harbor. 6 aircraft carriers, over 350 planes, and a fleet of submarines turned the calm Hawaiian morning into an inferno. Battleships sank. Sailors burned. The Pacific shook with thunder. In Japan, people cheered. The radio declared it a divine victory. For a moment, it felt like revenge, like justice for decades of being dismissed, judged, and ignored. But that illusion would not last. The next day, America declared war, and in that single decision, Japan sealed its fate. The empire that had risen from humiliation would fall under the weight of its own defiance. The dream of proving itself equal to the West ended not in triumph, but in ashes, in Hiroshima, in Nagasaki, in surrender. Yet behind the destruction lies a deeper story. Japan's role in World War I wasn't just a footnote, it was the fuse. The rejection, the pride, the hunger for recognition, all of it built the mindset that led to Pearl Harbor. Japan didn't wake up one morning and decide to wage war. It was driven there, step by step, by a century of exclusion and arrogance from the world's so-called civilized powers. And maybe that's the tragedy of it all. A nation that once sought acceptance ended up destroying itself, trying to demand it. The dream of equality was twisted into empire. The desire for dignity turned into domination. And by the time the world finally took Japan seriously, it was already too late. History often paints Japan's entry into World War II as madness, But when you trace the thread back to World War I, you see the logic flawed, emotional, human. The same pain that drives a man to prove himself can also drive him to ruin. Japan's story is a reminder that wars don't start with bullets. They start with wounds. Wounds the world refuses to heal. If you've learned something today that changed how you see history, hit that like button. It helps us tell the untold stories that textbooks forget. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. And tell us in the comments, do you think Japan was pushed into war, or did it choose it? Because sometimes the truth lies not in who fired first, but in who felt ignored the longest.